She wasn't supposed to be there. A Navy officer. Decorated. Disciplined. Done with men who carried guns for reasons other than duty. And yet, there she was. Standing in the rain outside a Seoul mansion that didn't appear on any official map, holding a crumpled job listing that simply read, "Nanny needed. No questions. Generous pay. Interviews, Thursday." Amara Mensah had survived 3 deployments, 2 submarine rescues, and 1 very dramatic breakup with a man who cried at car commercials. She was not afraid of anything. But when the iron gate swung open and she saw him, tall, jaw sharp enough to cut glass, eyes like frozen midnight, wearing a suit that cost more than her entire military salary, her heart did something it had absolutely no business doing. It stuttered. He looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't planned for. She looked at him like she was already calculating her exit strategy. Neither of them moved for a full 5 seconds. And then, from somewhere behind him, came the tiniest, most heartbreaking sound she had ever heard. A little girl. Maybe 5 years old. Standing at the top of the staircase in a white dress, clutching a stuffed rabbit, staring at Amara with eyes so wide and so empty that Amara felt something crack open inside her chest. The child hadn't smiled in 8 months. Not since her mother died. And nobody, not the nannies, not the therapists, not even her father with all his terrifying power, had been able to bring her back. Until now. Until Amara. But nobody knew that yet. Before we begin, my mum said this video cannot reach 10,000 views and 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong. Smash that like button, subscribe right now, and drop in the comments where you are watching from. Now let's get into this story. Amara Mensah had not planned to apply for a nanny position. Let's be very clear about that. She was a lieutenant commander in the Ghanaian Navy, currently on a 4-month sabbatical in Seoul, South Korea, because her best friend Efua had begged her, physically begged her, got on her knees and everything, to come keep her company while Efua finished her graduate research program at Yonsei University. "It'll be fun," Efua had said. "You need to rest, Amara. You need to decompress. You need to meet someone who isn't carrying a weapon for the government." Amara had laughed at that last part. She was not looking for anyone. She had a very organized, very satisfying life that involved exactly 0 romantic entanglements and approximately 17 skincare products. She was fine. She was thriving. She was also, as of Tuesday morning, completely and catastrophically bored. Efua spent 12 hours a day in the university library. Amara had already visited every museum in Seoul. She had hiked Bukhansan Mountain twice. She had learned to make kimchi from a 70-year-old woman named Mrs. Park who kept calling her the tall African queen, with an energy that was both alarming and deeply flattering. So when she found the small printed card tucked under the windshield wiper of Efua's car, the one that read "Nanny needed, generous compensation, inquire within, 14, Cheongdam Private Estate," she had only picked it up out of curiosity. She had only Googled the address out of boredom. She had only shown up at the interview because she thought it would be an interesting story to tell Efua over dinner. That was her story and she was absolutely sticking to it. "You're not Korean." Those were the first words he said to her. Not hello. Not welcome. Not even please come in out of the rain. Just a flat, observational statement delivered in perfect English with an accent that did something completely unfair to her nervous system. Amara looked up at him from under her completely useless in Korean rain umbrella and smiled the way she smiled at difficult superior officers, with her whole face and absolutely none of her warmth. "Excellent observation," she said. "You're not a nanny agency." Something moved behind his eyes. It wasn't quite amusement. It was more like the face a chess player makes when the other person makes an unexpected move. He stepped back from the doorway. "Come in." Was that an invitation or a command? "In this house," he said quietly, "they are the same thing." Amara should have turned around. Every single instinct she had spent a decade sharpening in the Navy told her to turn around, walk back down that rain-slicked driveway, and go home to her skincare routine and her dignity. She walked in. The house was enormous and immaculate and somehow deeply lonely in the way that only very expensive spaces can be. Everything was perfect. The flowers were fresh. The floors gleamed. The art on the walls was the kind that made you feel like you were being evaluated rather than entertained. There was no warmth anywhere. Except Appa. The voice came from the top of the curved staircase. Small. Careful. Like a bird testing a branch it wasn't sure would hold. Amara looked up. The little girl was maybe 5, dressed in cream-colored pajamas printed with tiny moons, clutching a rabbit-stuffed animal that had clearly been loved nearly to pieces. Her dark hair was slightly mussed from sleep. Her eyes, her father's eyes, that same frozen midnight shade, were fixed entirely on Amara with an expression that was 1 part curiosity and 2 parts something that looked painfully like hope. The man, her father, stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Sua," he said gently. "Go back to bed." The child didn't move. She kept staring at Amara with those huge, searching eyes. Amara, who had negotiated with pirates, who had kept her voice steady during a Category 4 storm in the Atlantic, who had once talked a panicking sailor down from the edge of a ship deck at 2 in the morning, felt her throat tighten. She lifted her hand in a small wave. "Hey, little one," she said softly in English, then added in the careful Chui her grandmother had given her, the warm syllables falling naturally, "Waho ti sen?" "How are you?" The child's eyes went wide. And then, just for a fraction of a second, the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. The memory of one. But it was something. Behind Amara, she heard the sharp intake of breath from the man who controlled half of Seoul's underground empire, who had buried his wife 8 months ago, who had not been able to reach his daughter since. And she understood, without anyone explaining a single thing, exactly why she had walked through that door. "Mister," she began. "Kwon," he said. His voice had changed. Something in it had cracked open, just slightly, in the way that only happened to people who had been holding themselves together by sheer terrifying willpower for far too long. Kwon Jae-won. Amara turned to look at him fully. He was looking at his daughter. And the expression on his face, this man who had walked into the room like a wall, like a warning, like something carved from cold stone, was the most heartbreakingly human thing she had ever seen. Love. Raw and helpless and absolutely desperate. "Oh no," Amara thought. "Oh no, no, no." "Lieutenant Commander Amara Mensah," she said, extending her hand with military precision. "Ghanaian Navy, currently on sabbatical. Apparently also, as of tonight, your new nanny." He looked at her hand. Then at her face. Then, slowly, he shook it. His hand was warm. She had not expected that. "You said you were a Navy officer," he said. "I am." "Why would a Navy officer want to be a nanny?" Amara glanced up at the staircase. Sua was still there, still watching, the stuffed rabbit now pressed to her cheek. "I don't know yet," Amara said honestly. "But I think your daughter might." The silence that followed was long and strange and full of something neither of them had a name for. Yet. The contract was 12 pages long. 12. Amara sat across from Kwon Jae-won at a dining table that could comfortably seat 20 people and read every single word of it while he watched her with the patience of a man who was accustomed to people doing exactly what he expected them to do. She reached page 4 and stopped. "Clause 7, she said. "Yes. The nanny shall not inquire about the nature of Mr. Kwon's business, his associates, his schedule, or any visitors to the property." She looked up. "So basically, see nothing, hear nothing, know nothing." "Correct. That's a lot of nothings for a very large house. It's a very private household. She turned to page 7. Stopped again. Clause 14. The nanny shall not form personal attachments beyond the scope of professional childcare duties. She set the contract down and folded her hands on the table. "Mr. Kwon, I'm going to be taking care of your 5-year-old daughter. Personal attachment is literally the job." Something flickered in his expression. "The clause refers to." "I know what the clause refers to." She held his gaze without blinking. She had held eye contact with commanding officers 3 ranks above her. Kwon Jae-won's stare was more intense than most of them, but her eyes were not moving. "I'm telling you that it's counterproductive to your actual goal, which is getting your daughter to emotionally engage with the world again. Children don't heal in professional environments. They heal in safe ones. So if you want me to help Sua, and I think you do, or we wouldn't be sitting here at 11 p.m. in the rain, then you need to let me actually do it. The silence stretched. A clock ticked somewhere in the house. Expensive sound. Lonely sound. You've read one child psychology article, Kwon said. I've read 47, Amara replied pleasantly. I had a lot of time on submarines. His jaw moved. She was almost certain he was suppressing something. The pay, he said finally, sliding a separate document across the table. Amara looked at the number. She looked at it again. She maintained her composure through 3 full seconds of internal screaming. That's monthly, she said. Weekly. She picked up the pen. She signed the contract. She was absolutely going to regret this. Her room was on the 3rd floor, larger than her entire apartment in Accra, with a bathroom that had a soaking tub, heated floors, and a window that looked out over Seoul glittering like a scattered handful of stars. There was fresh fruit on the bedside table and a note in careful English that said simply, "Breakfast is at 7. Sua eats only if someone eats with her." Amara read it twice. Eats only if someone eats with her. She thought about a little girl sitting at a table alone for 8 months, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. She set the note down and pressed her hand flat against the window glass, cold against her palm. "All right, Amara," she whispered to herself. "You're here now." She was woken at 6:59 by the softest possible knock on her door. So soft she almost missed it. She opened the door and found Sua standing in the hallway in her moon pajamas, rabbit under one arm, looking up at Amara with the careful expressionless face of a child who had learned not to want things too loudly in case they disappeared. Amara crouched down to eye level. "Good morning," she said. Then, with a theatrical groan, "Please tell me the coffee in this house is good, because I am not a morning person and I need you to prepare yourself for that information." Sua stared at her. "I'm serious," Amara continued, standing and stretching dramatically. "I have survived naval combat training. I have survived open water exercises in December. I have not fully survived mornings. We're going to be honest about this up front." The ghost of something, that not quite smile again, passed across Sua's face. She turned and began walking toward the stairs. Amara followed. Downstairs, the kitchen was vast and gleaming and smelled of coffee that was, Amara discovered approximately 40 seconds later, absolutely magnificent. She groaned into her first sip with entirely undignified relief. Oh, that's good. That's very good. Okay. I take back at least 30% of my reservations about this job." "Only 30? She spun around. Kwon Jae-won was standing in the kitchen doorway in a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, holding his own coffee cup, watching her with an expression that was carefully neutral except for the very edges of it. Amara straightened with military posture. "The other 70%, she said with dignity, "is pending further evaluation." He looked at his daughter. Sua had climbed onto a kitchen stool and was watching Amara with focused attention, rabbit in her lap. "She came to get you," he said quietly. It wasn't quite a question. She did. He looked at his coffee cup. His throat moved. "She hasn't come to get anyone in," he stopped. "I know," Amara said gently. He looked up sharply, like he wasn't accustomed to being interrupted in the middle of vulnerability. Amara didn't apologize. She turned back to the coffee machine and began figuring out how to make hot chocolate from what appeared to be approximately 94 different buttons. "Sua," she said conversationally, "do you want to help me figure out this machine? Because your father's kitchen is intimidating and I refuse to admit defeat in front of him this early." From behind her, she heard it. Not a laugh. Not yet. But the small, uncertain exhale that comes just before one. She was going to get this child to laugh if it was the last thing she did. She was also going to need to stop noticing how warm Kwon Jae-won's hands had been. She was absolutely, completely, 100% going to stop noticing that. The first sign that this was not a normal household came at noon. 3 black SUVs pulled into the driveway. 6 men in dark suits got out and went into Kwon's study and the doors closed and nobody came out for 2 hours. Amara was in the garden with Sua, doing what she had decided to call structured observation time and what was actually just lying in the grass looking at clouds and making up stories about them. That one, Amara said, pointing, looks like a very confused goat who has made several questionable decisions. Sua looked at it seriously. She pointed at another cloud. Amara looked. It was vaguely rectangular. A book. Amara guessed. Sua shook her head. She pointed more insistently. A door? A window? A phone? A very flat building. Sua's shoulders shook. It was not a laugh. It was the shape of one. The structure. The outline. Amara felt it like a fist around her heart. I'm going to figure it out, she told the cloud very seriously. I have all the time in the world. Behind them, she heard the front door. She turned. Kwon Jae-won was standing on the back steps, jacket gone now, watching his daughter's shaking shoulders with an expression that Amara had no word for in English or Chui or any language she spoke. He caught her eye. She held it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked back at the clouds, and pointed at a new one, and said, that one is definitely a very judgmental cat. Sua. Don't look at it directly. This time the sound Sua made was almost, a giggle. And from the steps, quiet as a secret, Kwon Jae-won exhaled like a man setting down something he had been carrying for 8 months. 4 days into the job, Amara discovered the guns. Not in a dramatic way. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for Sua's missing rabbit. The child had left it somewhere on the 2nd floor and refused to sleep without it, and she had opened what she thought was a linen closet. It was not a linen closet. It was an armory. Not a huge one, but a very organized, very serious one, with weapons secured in cases and a keypad on the wall and a cleanliness to it that spoke of professional habit rather than emergency hoarding. Amara closed the door. She stood in the hallway for exactly 5 seconds. Then she opened the next door. Linen closet. She found the rabbit on the 3rd try. It had fallen behind a bookshelf in the upstairs reading room, and she brought it to Sua and tucked them both in and sang a Ghanaian lullaby that her grandmother had taught her, low and warm in the dark. Awura, D3 en na wohu? What do you see, little one? Sua's eyes stayed open, watching Amara's face, but her breathing gradually slowed and deepened and the grip on the rabbit loosened as she finally surrendered to sleep. Amara sat for a moment in the dim room. Then she went to find the boss. Kwon Jae-won was in his study. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting for permission, which she could tell from the expression on his face was not something people typically did. Your linen closet is a weapons cache, she said pleasantly, closing the door behind her. He set down his pen. I know. I'm just flagging it, she continued, sitting across from him with the composed ease of someone who had attended naval intelligence briefings, because I opened it looking for a stuffed rabbit, and I feel it's important that we establish some kind of communication protocol for situations like these so that I don't, for example, accidentally stumble into something that gets me disappeared. He stared at her. You're not afraid, he said. It wasn't admiring. It was more like he was updating a calculation. I didn't say that, Amara said. I said I wanted a communication protocol. Those are different things. Most people who discover that room don't discuss it calmly. Most people haven't been on a naval vessel in a Category 4 hurricane. She crossed her legs. Mr. Kwon. I'm not naive about what kind of household this is. I'm choosing to be here anyway, because your daughter needed someone and I am apparently constitutionally incapable of walking away from a child who needs someone. But I need to know one thing. He waited. Is she safe? Amara asked. Sua. Whatever you do, whatever world you operate in, is she safe in this house? The air in the room changed. Kwon Jae-won looked at her for a long moment. And then he said, with a quiet intensity that Amara felt in her sternum, there is nothing in this world or any other that would be allowed to touch her. She believed him. She shouldn't have found that attractive. Good, she said, standing. Then we understand each other. She was at the door when he spoke. Lieutenant Commander. She turned. He was still looking at her with that expression she couldn't categorize. You sang to her. I did. She let you. She did. The silence. She hasn't let anyone. He stopped himself again. Second time she'd watched him stop himself at the edge of something real. Thank you, he said instead. Quiet. Like the words cost him something. Amara nodded once, the way she acknowledged her officers. Get some sleep, Mr. Kwan, she said. You look like a man who hasn't in a while. She left before she could see his face do whatever it was about to do. She made it all the way to her room and was approximately 4 seconds into her skincare routine when she pressed both hands to her cheeks and said quietly to her own reflection, Amara. No. Her reflection offered no useful input. The date happened by accident. Sua's therapist had recommended, gently and in writing, which Amara had read because Kwan had asked her to, that Sua be reintroduced to public spaces gradually, starting small. A park. A bakery. Something quiet, somewhere familiar. Amara had taken her to a small patisserie 3 blocks from the estate. Saturday morning. The city still gentle with weekend slowness. Sua had stood in front of the pastry display with the most emotion Amara had seen on her face. Silent wonder, small and concentrated, like she was seeing something after a very long time in the dark. Pick whatever you want, Amara said. Sua pointed at a cream puff. Excellent choice, Amara said solemnly. You have good taste. That's going to serve you well in life. She ordered it and a coffee for herself, and they sat at a small round table by the window, and Sua ate the cream puff with the focused dedication of a tiny scientist conducting an important experiment. The door opened. Kwon Jae-won walked in. He stopped when he saw them. Amara's coffee cup paused halfway to her mouth. I called the house, he said, like he needed to explain himself, which she found interesting. Mrs. Yun said you'd come here. And you followed us to a pastry shop, Amara said, setting her cup down. I had a concern. About cream puffs? From across the table, Sua looked between them. She pointed at the remaining half of her cream puff, then at her father, with a look that was almost imperious. Sit down, Appa. He sat down. He sat across from his daughter in a tiny patisserie on a Saturday morning in his clearly not casual dark coat, surrounded by families and strollers and a couple sharing earbuds, looking profoundly like a man who had forgotten how to inhabit ordinary moments. Amara caught the waiter. Another cream puff, please. And, she glanced at Kwan, what do you drink? He looked slightly caught off guard. Americano. 1 Americano. Sua, apparently satisfied, resumed eating. Kwan looked at his daughter. Amara watched him watching her and thought, there it is again. That enormous, helpless love. Wearing him from the inside out. She's doing better, Amara said quietly, so only he could hear. I can see that. It's going to keep getting better. He looked at her. Really looked, the way he didn't usually allow himself to. How do you know? Because she's here, Amara said simply. She could have refused. She could have stayed home. She chose to come out into the world. That was entirely her. I just offered the cream puff. The pastry arrived. Kwan looked at it. I haven't eaten a cream puff since, he stopped. Third time. Always stopping himself. Since your wife, Amara said, not as a question. The briefest pause. She liked them. Tell Sua that, Amara said. He blinked. Tell her, Amara said gently, firmly. Children don't need the people they love to be strong all the time. They need to know that love doesn't disappear when people do. The silence that followed was the longest yet. And then Kwon Jae-won, who ran an empire with an iron hand, who had not allowed himself to be seen being anything less than immovable for 8 months, reached across the table and broke the cream puff in half. He put one half in front of Sua. He ate the other. Sua looked at her half. Then at her father. Then at Amara. And she smiled. Not a ghost. Not an outline. A real, full, 5-year-old sunrise of a smile, sudden and brilliant and so heartbreakingly beautiful that Amara had to look out the window immediately and blink several times and perform an extremely convincing impression of someone who was just watching a pigeon. She was not crying. She was absolutely not crying. Under the table, she felt something brush her hand. She looked down. Kwan's hand. Resting near hers. Not quite touching. But near. When she looked up, he was watching his daughter. But his hand didn't move. Neither did hers. She told herself it was the job. The connection she felt, that pull, that specific gravitational wrongness of being too aware of where he was in a room, was professional investment. Transference. The natural result of being embedded in someone's most vulnerable space during their most vulnerable season. She had a psychology article for this. Probably. She was in the garden on Tuesday morning doing her stretches. A combination of Navy calisthenics and a yoga sequence Efua had sent her, when he appeared on the steps with 2 coffees and the expression of a man pretending he hadn't specifically come outside because she was there. "You're up early," she said, not stopping her stretch. "I have a meeting at 9. It's 6:42. I like to prepare." "By watching someone do yoga in your garden?" The expression on his face when he was suppressing something had become one of her favorite things to observe. It did this interesting thing where his jaw tightened very slightly and his eyes went momentarily more alive before the control came back down. "Suar is still asleep," he said. "Until 7. She had a good night." Amara straightened and accepted the coffee he held out with a look. "Thank you." "She talked yesterday," he said. Amara went still. "I know. She said your name." "I know." It had happened during their afternoon craft session. Amara had set up a finger painting station because Suar's therapist had recommended sensory engagement, and somewhere in the middle of a very abstract green catastrophe, Suar had looked up and said, clearly and quietly, "Amara." Not a request. Not a question. Just naming her. Claiming her. The way children do when they decide someone is real. Amara had looked at the green paint on her hands and said, "Yes." Very casually, like her whole heart hadn't just rearranged itself. "That's the first word she's spoken in 2 months, Kwan said now. "I know," Amara said for the 3rd time, because she didn't have anything else. Some things didn't need more words than that. He was standing very close. Seoul mornings were cool still and the garden smelled of the jasmine that climbed the eastern wall, and somewhere in the neighborhood a radio was playing something she didn't recognize. "I owe you more than what we agreed," he said. "You don't owe me anything," Amara said. "I'm doing my job." "You're doing more than your job. Then consider it a personal interest." "In what?" he said very quietly. "My daughter? Or Mr. Kwan?" She looked at him directly. Naval discipline. Eyes steady. Heart doing whatever it wanted behind her ribs, which she was choosing to ignore. Don't ask questions you're not ready to hear the answers to. The garden was very quiet. "What makes you think I'm not ready?" he said. She studied him. This man who had learned to make everything into a fortress. Who held his grief like a classified document. Who had come outside at 6:42 in the morning with 2 coffees for reasons neither of them were going to name yet. "Because," she said, "you're still figuring out how to sit in a patisserie without feeling like a trespasser in normal life. And that's okay. But it means we're both going to need to be patient." Something in his face. Not the control failing exactly, but the control choosing to step aside. "Just briefly. I've been told," he said slowly, "that I'm not a patient man." "I've been told," she replied, "that I am not a cautious woman. We're both going to have to grow." He almost smiled. She would think about that almost for the rest of the day. The threat came on Friday. She didn't know that's what it was at first. She just noticed the car, same model, dark, parked in different spots across the street over 3 days. Noticed the way the household security tightened without announcement, the way the men who came and went from Kwan's study began wearing slightly harder expressions. She noticed because she was trained to notice. Because the Navy had taught her threat assessment the way other people learn to drive, until it was automatic, unremarkable, just the way her eyes moved through a space. She said nothing until Friday evening, when she knocked on Kwan's study door after Suar was asleep. He looked up from his desk. "The car on the northeast corner has been repositioned 3 times in 4 days," she said, closing the door behind her. Today there were 2 of them. One rotated out at 1400 hours and was replaced within 40 minutes, which means they're coordinating. That's not surveillance. That's assessment. The look on his face. Not surprise. But something that was almost respect? You noticed, he said. I notice things. She sat down without being asked. She had stopped asking his permission for things that were reasonable. Are we in danger? Is she in danger? No. The word was flat and certain. It's a territorial dispute. A business competitor testing edges. It won't reach this house. You're sure? I've dealt with these situations before. He paused. Many times before. And if something escalates? Then I escalate back. His voice carried a quality she recognized, the same quiet certainty she'd heard in the voices of captains who had been in actual combat. I have done worse than whatever you are imagining, and I am still here. She should have found it alarming. She found it steadying instead. What do you need from me? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. You're asking how you can help. I'm asking what the situation requires. You're a Navy officer on sabbatical, he said. This isn't your war. I am a woman living in a house with a child I care about, Amara said. That changes the math. Silence. Stay close to Suwa, he said finally. Don't leave the estate until I say so. That's all. That's all. That's everything, he said quietly. She understood that too. The whole empire, and it all came down to, stay near my daughter. That's everything. She stood to leave. Amara. Her name in his voice was different. Lower. Like something he'd been holding back and had only now decided to let out to exactly that degree of volume and no further. She turned. You asked me the first night if she was safe. He was looking at his desk. I want you to know the same is true for you. Whatever happens. Whatever you've walked into, by coming here. She took that in. I know, she said. And she did. She walked down the hallway and stood at the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the street where the surveillance car had been, dark and absent now, and thought about what it meant to trust a man whose world operated entirely outside the rules she'd spent her whole life serving. Thought about the way he'd said her name. Thought about Suara's smile in the patisserie, brilliant as a coin turning in sunlight. She was in trouble. She knew it the way she'd known storms before they arrived, not the storm itself, but the particular quality of the air. The change in pressure. The certainty that something was coming that would rearrange everything. She was absolutely, completely, spectacularly in trouble. And she had absolutely no intention of running. Efua was, objectively, not helping. You're telling me, her best friend said over video call, gesturing with a spoonful of yogurt for emphasis, that he is rich, devastatingly good-looking, emotionally damaged in an interesting and fixable way, devoted to his daughter, and has eyes like, what did you say? I didn't. Frozen midnight. You said frozen midnight, Amara, I wrote it down. I said it in a descriptive context. You're in love with him. I have been in this house for 11 days. 11 days is plenty of time. I fell in love with Marco in 4 days and we dated for 2 years. And then he moved to Portugal. Unrelated. Efua pointed the spoon at the screen. Amara. I know your face. I know your voice. I know the face you are making right now, which is the face you made when you were 17 and had a crush on our geography teacher and spent 3 months pretending you had extra questions about continental drift. That was about the curriculum. His name was Mr. Asante and he had very nice arms. I'm ending this call. Tell him how you feel. Efua called as the screen went dark. Amara sat in the silence of her enormous, heated floor room and had a serious conversation with herself about professionalism, boundaries, and the general foolishness of developing feelings for a man who owned an illegal armory and had the emotional accessibility of a classified government document. The conversation concluded inconclusively. It was a Thursday when the almost kiss happened. She and Suwa had built a fort. This had been Suara's idea. The child had begun initiating things, which her therapist had described over email as remarkable accelerated progress and which Amara described to herself as Suwa has decided to be alive again and is doing it at full speed. She had dragged blankets from her room and pointed at the living room couch with the authority of someone planning a military operation. Fort, Suwa said. She was using more words now. Not full sentences yet, but words, deliberate and clear, delivered with the confidence of someone who had decided language was worth the effort again. Fort, Amara agreed seriously. Strategic. Defensible. Good sight lines to the kitchen. Sua nodded like this was exactly what she had been thinking. They built it large enough for 2-3 as it turned out, because Kwon appeared in the living room doorway at 7:15, and Sua looked at him and then looked at the fort and then held up the blanket edge with the universal child expression for get in. He looked at the fort. He looked at Amara. She looked back at him with an expression she carefully kept neutral. She's the general, Amara said. You don't disobey the general. Kwon Jae-won, who ran an empire, who had not been disobeyed in years, folded himself into a blanket fort constructed by his 5-year-old daughter. Inside, with the blankets muffling the world and the fairy lights Amara had strung along the couch cushions casting everything in warm gold, Sua sat between them and produced a picture book and handed it to Amara with the expectation of someone who had already determined how this evening would go. Amara read it, a Korean children's book she had been teaching herself phonetically for exactly this reason, stumbling over syllables in ways that made Sua's mouth twitch and eventually reach over and point at the word Amara had mispronounced. Yes, Amara said gravely. I see that. I stand corrected. Sua looked at her father. She said something in Korean, low and quick. Kwon's breath caught. What did she say? Amara asked. When he spoke, his voice was not quite steady. She said, he stopped. Collected himself. She said you read like her mom. The quiet inside the fort was like being held. Her mother read to her? Amara asked gently. Every night, he said. She did voices. Different ones for every character. A pause. Sua used to laugh, he stopped. Looked down at his daughter, who had leaned against his arm with the rabbit tucked under her chin. She used to laugh every night. She will again, Amara said. He looked at her. They were very close. The fort made the world small. His daughter was between them, breathing slowly now, heavy-eyed with the approach of sleep. You're sure, he said, very quietly. I'm sure, she said. Something moved across his face, that same thing she'd seen in the garden, the control choosing to step briefly aside. His eyes were very dark in the fairy-like gold and she was close enough to see the exact moment that his gaze dropped from her eyes to her mouth and then went very deliberately back up. Her heart was not behaving. Amara, he started. Sua, perfectly timed, made the soft sound of complete surrender to sleep, going boneless against her father's side. He looked down at her. The moment passed. Floated away. Left behind only its own evidence, the warmth, the proximity, the exact shape of what hadn't been said. He looked back up. She was already looking at Sua too. She should be in bed, Amara said. Yes, he said. Neither of them moved for another full minute. The actual kiss happened later. After Sua was in bed, rabbit secured, moon pajamas on, Amara's lullaby sung soft and low until sleep came. She came downstairs to find him in the kitchen. Just standing there with his coffee like he'd been waiting, which he was going to deny probably, if she asked him directly. She didn't ask. She set her empty glass in the sink and turned and he was right there. Closer than he'd meant to be, or closer than he was going to admit to meaning, and the kitchen was quiet and the house was asleep and Seoul glittered through the window and she thought, I am a Navy officer. I have made harder decisions than this. She looked at him. J1, she said. First time she'd used his name. He stilled. Is this, she started. Yes, he said. Like he'd already had the whole conversation with himself and arrived at the answer before she finished the question. When he kissed her it was careful and deliberate and somehow still warmer than she had imagined, which she was retroactively admitting she had done. She kissed him back with the same certainty she brought to everything. When they separated, the kitchen was the same kitchen. The city was the same city. Everything was different. This, she said quietly, is going to be complicated. Yes, he said. I don't regret it. Neither do I. We should discuss. Tomorrow, he said. We can discuss everything tomorrow. She looked at him. Are you avoiding the conversation? I'm giving us one night to just, he searched for the word. To just be here. Without discussing what it means. She considered that. One night, she said. One night. She walked to the doorway and turned back. He was watching her with an expression she finally had a name for. Hope. Raw and terrifying and new. Good night, Kwon Jae-won, she said. Good night, Lieutenant Commander, he said. She laughed, actually laughed, and the sound of it surprised them both. The morning after a first kiss in a quiet kitchen should be awkward. Amara had prepared for awkward. She had a strategy for awkward, breezy, professional, perhaps a reference to the weather. What she had not prepared for was Kwon Jae-won at the breakfast table with Sua, cutting fruit with the patience of a man with nowhere else to be, and looking up when Amara walked in and simply, softening. The whole posture of him shifting into something more open, like a window being unlatched. He poured her coffee. She sat down. Sua looked between them with the eyes of a child who noticed everything and filed it in an internal system that was more sophisticated than most adults gave her credit for. She pointed at her father. Then at Amara. Then at her own small chest. You and me. That's right, Amara said, without hesitation. All three of us. Sua returned to her toast, satisfied. Kwon's hand found Amara's briefly under the table. Not long. Just a moment. A confirmation. Yes. All three of us. The weeks that followed were the best and strangest weeks of Amara's life. By day, Sua's world expanding like a flower in accelerated time. First the garden. Then the patisserie. Then the small park 2 blocks over where she began approaching other children with the careful, scientific curiosity of someone relearning how to be among people. Then, on a bright April Tuesday, actual laughter. Real, full, unguarded laughter because Amara had stepped on a particularly crinkly leaf and performed an entirely excessive dramatic reaction. Laughter that stopped Kwon where he stood on the path behind them and kept him there for a long moment before he schooled his face back into something resembling composure. By night, things that were harder to categorize and easier to feel. Long conversations in the kitchen after the house was asleep, the kind that moved between languages, between silences, between the things you said directly and the things you communicated by staying when you could have left. He told her about growing up in a family where power was inherited the way other families inherited property, without choice, without ceremony, just as the terms of your existence. She told him about the sea, how she'd known since she was a girl in Accra watching the Atlantic that she wanted to serve something larger than herself, how the Navy had given her a language for that want that she couldn't have built alone. He listened to her like every word was information he intended to keep. She listened to him the same way. They were careful with each other. Careful and deliberate and aware of the specific fragility of something that was new and real and hadn't been tested yet by anything harder than Tuesday mornings and kitchen conversations. She knew there would be harder things. She just didn't know how soon. The call came on a Saturday. Amara was in the garden with Sua, attempting to teach her a clapping game from her own childhood in Accra, Kai Kai Kyul, with varying levels of success and a remarkable amount of giggling from both parties. Sua had graduated from almost laughs to actual ones in recent days, and each one still hit Amara in the chest like a small, perfectly aimed miracle. Kwon's head of security, a large, quiet man named Sung-ho who communicated primarily in single syllables and meaningful eyebrow movements, appeared at the garden door. "Sir needs you," he said to Amara. "Not Kwon. Her." She registered the phrasing, told Sua she'd be right back, and followed him inside. Kwon was in the study. He was standing, which was how she knew it was serious. He was almost always seated when she came to him. Standing meant something that couldn't be handled from a seated position. There was a man in the chair across the desk that she didn't recognize. Except, she did. Older. In a civilian suit that didn't quite fit the posture underneath it. And the posture, she knew that posture. She'd worn it herself for a decade. Military. Her stomach dropped. "Lieutenant Commander Mensah," the man said. His English was Korean accented and precisely formal. "I'm Colonel Park, Ghanaian Korean Joint Naval Intelligence Liaison Office." He paused. "I think you know why I'm here." She did not look at Kwon. She kept her eyes on the colonel. "How did you find me?" she said. Her voice was perfectly level. The Navy had trained her for this too, for the moment when the two halves of an impossible situation came into the same room. We've been monitoring this household for 6 weeks, the colonel said. When we identified you as an embedded contact, we wanted to bring you in for a briefing. A pause. Or confirm whether you're operational. The word landed in the room like a stone. Operational. She felt Kwon go absolutely still beside her. I'm on personal leave, she said. That's one characterization, the colonel said. It's the accurate one. Lieutenant Commander. He leaned forward slightly. The man you are living with is under international surveillance by 3 governments. His organization has interests that are currently under active investigation. Your presence in this house, however personal your intentions, creates a significant intelligence and diplomatic situation. A pause that felt deliberate. We need to discuss your position. The room was very quiet. Amara felt the weight of it, the terrible geometry of it. Kwon, behind her. Sua in the garden. The career she had built over a decade. The world she had walked into 11 days ago by accident and had spent every day since choosing, over and over, on purpose. My position, she said slowly, is complicated. It can be uncomplicated, the colonel said, if you choose to cooperate. She heard Kwon breathe. She did not look at him. She looked at Colonel Park with her full, undivided, officer-grade attention and said, I'm going to need to think about this. You have until Monday, he said. After that. I heard you, she said. He stood. Left. Sung-ho closed the door behind him. The study was silent. Amara stood very still with her back to Kwon and thought about 3 governments. About operational. About a little girl in the garden learning a clapping game, giggling for the first time in 8 months. About a man who had kissed her in a kitchen and looked at her like she was something he hadn't known he was waiting for. About choices that were not, in any honest accounting, actually choices at all. Amara, he said. His voice was very careful. The way voices got when they were preparing for something. She turned. His face was controlled. But she knew how to read it now. Underneath the control, something braced, something waiting for the blow. Tell me, he said quietly, that you didn't know. She looked at him for a long moment. I didn't know, she said. Tell me the truth, he said. That is the truth, she said. I came here for a cream puff and a paycheck and because your daughter needed somebody. I did not know who you were. I did not know who was watching. I did not know any of this. She held his gaze. But I know it now. And I'm still here. And I am not going anywhere until someone gives me a very good reason to. The silence was different this time. Not cold. Not careful. Something larger. You could lose everything, he said. Your career. Your rank. I know. This is not your war. You said that before, she said. And I told you then, the math changes when someone I care about is involved. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. She looked up at him, this man, this complicated, grief-carrying, empire-running, cream-puff-eating man with frozen midnight eyes who had let her into the most private room of his life and his daughter's life and maybe carefully his own. What are you going to tell them? He said. I don't know yet, she said honestly. But whatever I decide, she held his gaze, I'm deciding it for myself. Not for the Navy. Not for you. For me. Because I'm still a woman who makes her own choices, even when those choices are terrifying. His hand came up and brushed her jaw, gentle and devastatingly careful. What do you want? He said. Very quietly. She opened her mouth to answer. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Ghanaian Naval Command. Admiral's office. Not her handler. Not Colonel Park. The Admiral. The color left her face. What is it? Kwon said. She looked up at him. That's my commanding officer, she said. Not the Colonel. The Admiral. What does that mean? Amara looked at the phone still ringing in her hand and thought about 6 weeks of surveillance and 3 governments and the word operational and the fact that the Admiral did not call personally for small matters. It means, she said slowly, this is bigger than I thought. She pressed accept. Admiral, she said. The voice on the other end was calm and authoritative and said 4 words that made her blood go cold. Come home, Lieutenant Commander. The call ended. Kwon was watching her. In the garden, through the window, she could see Sua still clapping her hands in the pattern Amara had taught her, practicing the rhythm, waiting for Amara to come back. Amara looked at Kwon. He looked at her. And in the space between them, in the specific silence of a story that is absolutely not finished, that has barely begun, will Amara choose her career, or the family she never planned to find? What does the Admiral know? And what is Kwon Jae-won prepared to do when the woman he's falling for is about to be pulled out of his world? Part 2 drops soon. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. And drop in the comments, Team Amara stays or Team Navy calls. Let's fight about it respectfully.